I want to be the person that I wish I had met when I was in that place. And so last year, Barbell Psychology was born. In conjunction with Daniel Arbilla, who's an exercise physiologist, set up shop in the city. So I've got basically like a typical sort of psychology therapy room with a squat rack and barbell and weight plates
I love the
sitting
setup.
behind it. So yeah.
Well, it's such a potent double, and I feel the irony is not lost. I speak to a lot of young physios who say, like, "Are we physios or psychologists?" So I love the potent double. It seems to make so much sense, and you've realized that. Um, Mate, I'm mindful of time because we're going to do 2 or 3 chats, hopefully around 20 or 30 minutes long. And just for the people on the Facebook Live, could you just leave a comment or a thumb, let us know that it's coming through okay, that you can see the slides and you can hear the audio. And I'm going to check my phone every now and then if you guys have any questions for Anthony. But we'll get straight into this. So what I was curious about, Anthony, is how do we actually classify this? Is it evidence based? Is it an opinion? Is it a spectrum at the moment? How do we classify, say, mental health, anxiety, and depression? Is it one and the same? Are the labels helpful? Is it a spectrum? That's a big question, but do your best to answer that briefly.
Yeah. in 10 words or less.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely it's a topic of controversy for sure in the world of psychology and mental health. Like, what is the benefit of classifying things? How do we do it in a way that is helpful?
Yep.
To be honest, the current system that we have is an absolute shit show, if I can use that word. The DSM-5 is sort of like the Bible of the diagnostic classifications, that's the one that's put out by the American Psychiatric Association. The World Health Organization has their own version of that as well. But look, essentially, as a psychologist in practice, in clinical practice, working with individuals struggling with a range of different mental health issues, DSM is primarily of interest to insurers, and perhaps the court system, and it has very little clinical value whatsoever. In fact, I would argue that it's probably often counterproductive to use this kind of approach, because I think we run a risk of pathologizing normal aspects of the human experience. And for every person who feels, a sense of relief that they have a diagnosis, that, it kind of normalizes their experience, I think there's at least, another 5 people who experience stigma and who are kind of led down a not very helpful path from receiving a diagnosis. People believe that a diagnosis should provide some kind of explanation as to what's going on. But you've got to remember, all these diagnoses in psychology or psychiatry are descriptive. They're not explanatory. So to say like, oh, someone has a diagnosis of depression, it doesn't tell me anything functionally about what's going on for that person and how they've arrived at where they are and what they need to get their life back on track. So as a psychologist working with an individual, what I want to know is functionally what's going on for this person, what's showing up that's getting in the way of them living their life to the fullest, what's interfering with their relationships, and what can I do to help them get their life back on track and live life more fully. And most of these labels are not very helpful in giving me any information about that.
It's a helpful narrative, and it parallels. There's a lot of young physios in iMoveU, and that's exactly what's happening with diagnosis in physiotherapy. Is that
Right.
Labeling things and the diagnosis itself is actually not that important, and in fact, sometimes it can be nocivic and can serve to make things worse. So that's showing through in the physiotherapy literature, and it sounds like it's paralleling what you're describing. I want to admit something to you, Anthony. I was away for 5 days and I watched probably 3 seasons of the Kardashians. Are you familiar with the epic body of work that is the Kardashians?
I can't say I've ever dedicated that amount of time, but I'm familiar that such a body exists. Yes.
What stood out to me was the word anxious, and my anxiety was mentioned almost every 2 or 3 minutes in every episode. And it kind of, I didn't mean to bring that up in this call. It kind of just reminded me when you said that of a label, and I wonder if that label is becoming more common in an unhelpful way. Are you noticing that?
Yeah, I think so. And look, if we, if you look at the DSM, what it is actually saying about anxiety disorders, they are one of the essential criteria for diagnosis of an anxiety disorder is a significant functional impairment. So we're not just talking about anxiety, the emotion, when we're talking about an anxiety disorder. We're talking about a syndrome, or like a range of experiences with anxiety, such that it interferes with this person's ability to live their life and causes some kind of significant functional impairment. But in the kind of wider popular culture, these words are kind of used interchangeably. So you'll hear people say like, "Oh, I have anxiety," as if the emotion of anxiety is itself, a mental illness. When of course, every human that has ever walked this earth has experienced anxiety, and rightly so. Without anxiety, we wouldn't survive any more than, not having pain would also be a terrible thing, because we need it to get information about potential threats to our body. So in fact, avoiding anxiety at all costs is a recipe for developing an anxiety disorder. We are highly adaptable, resilient creatures, us humans, and we have evolved to deal with great hardship and stress and challenges, and we thrive on it in the right context. Obviously, that can go badly wrong. But this idea that, if I can kind of just stay away from anxiety in my life, I'll achieve, great mental health and well-being. That couldn't be further from the truth. That would be the equivalent of saying like, well, the safest place, the best way for me to avoid injury is to stay in bed. So therefore staying in bed is the path to good health. Well, obviously that's going to lead to lots of problems. And so it's very, very much the same with a kind of psychological sort of stress and adaptation response.
Yeah, that it's the parallels are continuing with back pain, or your disc's out, or my back's out, and how that is often not what the person means. It's probably what they're feeling, but you continue to say that, and it has a whole lot of negative consequences. So yeah, that's really interesting. Anthony, I'm going to play these 2 videos. Let me know if you can see them, but I think you saw them offline. And thank you thank you guys for watching on Facebook. I can see you all on. And if you've got any questions for Anthony, we're going to leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end. And if you have any comments on these videos, most of you are just laughing that I watch the Kardashians though. So fair enough.
Rightly so, yeah.
Years ago, no one even knew what anxiety meant, but now it's like catching a cold. Every second kid in the events has anxiety or has some form of depression or something. Is it because it's become more normalized and they had it before and now we're just, we've got a way to show it? Or is it because there's social media and all this stuff affecting us where we do have these problems?
Did you get that video, Anthony?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And so the reason I chose that is I think it could, I felt it was a little blunt, and I feel like it could actually bring up some good discussion. But also that's what I'm hearing from a lot of business owners that I'm mentoring, is that it feels like everyone in my team is struggling mentally or with anxiety. And what's your perspective on that and that video?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of touching on a valid point, which goes to what I was just saying. I think we also need to be careful not to sort of kind of look at the past through rose-tinted lenses, as if there was some kind of golden era when our parents grew up, and and their parents gave them tough love, and no one ever had to say that they loved their kids, and no one, everyone kept their feelings inside, and that worked perfectly fine.
Yes.
It's certainly previous generations have had their problems too. So I think there's a lot of positives about being more open in talking about mental health, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, what have you. I think that's a great thing, and I think encouraging more conversations. But the narratives around that, I think, like I was saying, we need to be really careful that we're not pathologizing these experiences, and while at the same time not sort of trivializing or dismissing and sort of saying, oh, every man and his dog's got anxiety these days. Back in my day, we used to just kind of suck it up and get on with it. So if your team is talking a lot about anxiety, treat that as a opportunity to have some open dialogues and discussions, and notice your own stories about that are showing up for you. And see if you can kind of hold them lightly or leave them to the side, and really be present with what you're hearing and listening, and be curious and ask questions. And maybe different generations are using different language. Well, if so, learn the language, and see what you can learn. I think it would be a shame if perhaps business owners from sort of previous generations were dismissing those experiences and not taking them seriously, and kind of just labeling everything as sort of millennial or what are we up to? Generation Z?
I don't know. I don't know what we're up to.
Because, you have no idea what's going on in people's lives, outside of the workplace. And we need to be careful how we respond to people's lived experience, and really listen and make sure people feel heard before we start coming in with our advice and opinions.
That's really sound advice. And I think I'll play this next video. And I guess the question this is leading into is, do you feel it's more prevalent? And if so, why? Or is it just that we're more aware of it? So that's the question I had. I'll play this video first, which probably speaks to exactly what you just mentioned.
People who have an infinite variety of choices are less happy than people who only have one or two. The millennial generation that you're a part of suffered in some sense because they weren't deprived enough and had too many choices. The advantage to being deprived is that it's obvious what to do. Like if you're starving, then you eat. There's no question. But if you have enough to eat and you have enough shelter and you have enough information, maybe not as much as you could have, but enough, it starts to become difficult to decide what to do. And then you have another problem, which is that you can't decide what to do.
So that actual whole podcast was amazing, and the responses from the two other people there were probably disagreeing with what Jordan just said there. So I really like that snippet, but I'd encourage everyone to watch the whole thing. Do you think it's on the rise, and are there any reasons for you that you can identify, or what's your take on that?
I mean, this is like a $1 million question, and we will never have a kind of a definitive answer, because it's impossible to kind of compare data taken across generations, taken in different ways with different samples, etc. So I suppose there certainly seems to be much higher rates of diagnosis going on, but this gets back to what I was saying about the utility of making these diagnoses, and are we just kind of noticing what was already there before anyway, and are people now talking about it more freely? Who knows? I do agree with this idea, though, that Jordan Peterson was kind of alluding to, which is that kind of when we have all our sort of fundamental needs met and our basic kind of material comforts taken care of, for material needs, then it sort of frees us up to have an existential crisis.
That's really interesting.
If you're trying to feed your kids, you don't really have time to contemplate, what your purpose is and why you're here and that kind of thing. So there is that aspect to it. I think the more pertinent kind of thing, which is the big sort of change that has taken place in recent time, if you think about our sort of evolutionary history, physically, evolutionarily, we haven't changed for, let's say 250,000 years. But our social and cultural context has changed so dramatically in the last, 50, 100 years, that we are now this animal that we call human beings. We are now living in an environment that is so utterly different to the one that we evolved in, that we're basically running a kind of a mass social experiment, and we don't know the outcome, but I think it's fair to say that things are changing, and it would be reasonable to expect that we would see some changing outcomes as a result of that. And if people are getting more anxious and more depressed as a result of some of these changes, that wouldn't be surprising at all. I think the biggest change that is taking place is not all these sort of material things like you and me talking to each other on these little magic devices that beam our image across the world, but the social changes that have taken place. We have evolved to live in close-knit communities with extended family groups, where every day we are seeing dozens of people who know us intimately and care about us, and we are part of a big group that all work together and strive towards the same things, and we raise children together, and I've got aunties and uncles next door and all around me. That's the social context that we've evolved in. And the biggest change, the biggest shift in that now is, I think the kind of the separation and isolation and loneliness that we now experience in our kind of present day social structure.
It's a really interesting reflection, and something you said at the start there kind of landed. If you have all the options, it probably speaks to the video as well, then that can bring up those feelings for us. But if you have no options and you're in survival mode, potentially those feelings don't come up. Is that what's causing the divide between maybe that older generation? And where I noticed this is families who had an immigrant history, Southeast Asian families, and the older generation, or particularly like my grandparents who served in the war, right? It probably speaks to what you said. If you're in survival mode, or you're an immigrant, or you've gone to war, or maybe you came to this country with not much and lived off scraps for a little while, or they're the people I hear say it doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you mean when you say anxiety and mental health. So is that what's creating the clash? Because that's not a very big gap. That's only 30 or 40 years between someone who had no concept of it, maybe a different language, like you said, and a younger generation who has relative comfort and infinite choice. That comes through in some of the language I hear from some of our more distinguished business owners and older mentors. Is like, man, I just work 12-hour days and I don't know what you're talking about. It's a comment that I would hear a lot. Any reflection or add on to that?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge how much, the world has changed in that 30 or 40 years that you mentioned. It's a fundamentally different world that someone who's, in their mid-20s has grown up in compared to someone in their 50s or 60s. I think part of the problem with this sort of now that I've met all my sort of basic fundamental needs, and I'm also kind of surrounded by this culture of sort of well-being and wellness and kind of striving for self-development and self-actualization and that kind of thing. Now I have time and the sort of the focus to worry about how much I'm worrying, and so in this kind of culture of perhaps over pathologizing of the human experience, I think then people do a lot of like kind of looking at their experience and getting anxious about being anxious, and worrying about how much they're worrying, and so on. So so in the same way with, say, with pain or some kind of physical issue that someone is dealing with, the narrative that we have about what that experience means is so powerful, because it's going to determine how we treat that experience, what we do with it. And the worst thing to do with your emotions or your thoughts is to try to change them or get rid of them or push them away, or get into this kind of this struggle, this relationship with them where it's like, I can't have that, or I at least can't have more than this amount of anxiety or stress or whatever, because then you're going to start to get stressed about getting stressed.
That's a really, really important thing you're touching on there about not pushing it down and suppressing it, which maybe happened with an older generation. I know that I've experienced that myself. And when I speak to people who have been in this place, that's definitely something they experience. And when they seek help, that is often the solution, is we're not pushing this aside or down anymore. We're going to acknowledge it. Anthony, I'm mindful of time, and I love keeping these to kind of 30 to 40 minutes. So we're going to save a fair bit of this for a second part. For those of you watching,
sure.
we're going to go into the difference between CBT and ACT, but we'll save that. And what we can do as team members and employers. But if you guys have any questions, I can see your comments there, and I can see roughly 25 of you on. Leave them now, and we'll spend this last 5 minutes or so just answering those questions. This was a question that came through anonymously. How do we let our team members know, whether you're an employee or an employer or a contractor, but this came through as, if I'm struggling, how do I let people know without feeling like a burden? And I know that you and I discussed this a week ago when we first chatted. And I guess this is probably a key theme coming up for people is, well, we're all really busy. We're all clinicians. We've all got a lot going on. A lot of other people in my team might have cited mental health. What do I do here when I don't want to unload on someone or even feel that way? Do you have any reflections on this question?
So you're talking about, let's say, a clinician or someone working in a team, struggling with some mental health things going on for them, but not wanting to sort of let the side down or something like that. Is that sort of what you're alluding to?
Yeah, maybe they're feeling like they need to let someone know, or maybe it's reflecting in their performance, or maybe they need to let their employer know, or maybe it's an employer who feels like they're letting their team down and doesn't know how to tell them without feeling like a burden.
Yeah, look, I would encourage anyone who has concerns about their mental health to be proactive. These things, like any kind of physical issue as well. A stitch in time saves 9. You address it early. You can prevent so many more problems down the track. And so, yes, it might be a little bit of a problem that you create by raising this issue. But your choices are probably, a little problem now or a big problem later. There probably isn't a third option, which is, I'll just kind of bury this and pretend it's not happening and push on and hope that it goes away. So yeah, I would say, address things early, talk to people you trust, and seek professional help if you feel you need it.
Yeah, and I guess the message there is talk to someone, right? You might not feel like you're in the right place to tell a team member or an employer or an employee, but I guess what you're saying there is if you're delaying that, if you're pushing that aside, then that's not going to work out well.
Yeah, exactly. So just thinking of an example of a client who was struggling with some anxiety stuff for quite a while in their workplace. Part of that was about, always being a really high performer, and so not wanting to kind of let on that anything was going on with the boss. But of course, things got worse, and until they had no choice but to disclose. But by that stage, it was a case of saying, I need to take a significant amount of time off work now for stress leave and deal with these issues. Whereas 6 months earlier, it could have been more like saying, I could really do with a day or two off to focus on my mental health.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And yeah, little steps earlier better than huge steps later. Anthony, we might end on this, and we'll come back for another short chat around CBT and ACT, and maybe a little bit more advice around what to do as a team member and employer. But how can people build a relationship with a psychologist? Now, this has come from a physio, and also if people want to know more about you or explore your services, we could tie that in to wrap up.
So is the question about building a relationship with a psychologist, that in a professional capacity, like
Yes.
for a referral kind of relationship?
Yep, 100%.
Look, I guess I can only speak from personal experience, but whenever I've been contacted by other professionals or even like, you know, young people kind of entering this profession, if you send me an email, I will eventually reply to it. If you give me a call, I will always make time to speak to someone who is, you know, warm and friendly and polite and considerate. And I think, you know, as psychologists, we're generally pretty warm, approachable people. That's kind of why we get into this line of work. So honestly, if you just kind of like look up who are the local psychologists in your area, get in touch with them and let them know what you do, that you have patients who you might want to refer, and you know, ask if you can come and have a chat, you know, grab a coffee and build relationships, you know, the old-fashioned way.
I love that, and I would second that. In the community of about a dozen psychologists I know, they've all been more than open and welcoming and happy to do CPDs with you, because these two areas are overlapping more than ever. So it's definitely relevant. Anthony, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll organize a part 2 to talk a little bit more about what we can do as team members, the CBT and ACT model, because I know that will be relevant for health professionals, but also relevant to this discussion. Thank you so much, mate.
Awesome. Sounds good. Cheers, mate.
All right. I have stopped the live. Thank you, mate. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, pleasure.
Was that okay? Was there anything you would do differently or anything else you foresaw for that?
No, I don't think so. Yeah,
Perfect.
no, that was good.
Perfect. So maybe we'll arrange a part 2 in a week or two at a similar time, and we'll go over probably 2 or 3 of those other slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. If you want to send me a few options for days, and
yeah, awesome. Thank you, mate. Did you want to pop your brand up in the group, or refer people to a page or a blog that might be helpful, or anything like that? You're more than welcome to.
Yeah, sure. Okay. What's the best way to do that? In the comments on this video, or just a separate post? Or
yeah, 100%. If you want to do that, and even just shoot it to me in a message, so I can keep promoting that over the next 2 weeks for our next chat. That it'll be great to get people onto your page or wherever you think is a helpful resource for them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, mate. Have a good night, and we'll chat in Messenger and arrange a time soon.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds good.
Thanks, Anthony. Talk soon.
Cool. All right. Good night, mate. See ya.